Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Vestanland. This is episode 33, and in this episode, I am focusing on the southeast corner of the kind of island thing that contains the city of Nyrstad. And in this area, I'm going to be building a old sort of castle fort thing that's now just sort of a museum in this area. You'll see I'll do a lot of terraforming to kind of set this on a cliff. It ends up looking really cool. I'm not really sure what the backstory for it is now. You guys can tell me some of your ideas for that. However, before I get started with that project, I fill in this whole area here just with some kind of medium density residential. I also had a school. And yeah, just some general infill to kind of fill out the city. And yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I will get into the time lapse. Hey guys, as I mentioned in the intro, I am starting off the time lapse by building out this kind of medium density area to the east of some of the previous projects, and I'm starting off this little section of the city by sort of fleshing out this boulevard here, and I'm using a similar technique to what I did in an earlier episode where I built a boulevard with the street market. And what I'm doing is using the intersection marking tool to add these kind of filler island things that are blocking off basically half of the lanes. And this makes this a kind of safer, kind of more human scaled street, and instead of like a big arterial road. And yeah, I'm also using I don't think I showed it on screen, but I used the traffic manager lane connectors to kind of make sure that the cars are only using the lanes that are not obstructed by those grass islands. And then of course I'm also connecting up the bike lanes in this little area, and I'm using again intersection marking tool to sort of visually connect these to the kind of intersecting streets which have bike lanes so that people can get around using bicycles, which is also a good addition to the area. Another thing I'm doing is kind of fleshing out this roundabout that kind of marks a major kind of landmark and is where a bunch of different transit lines intersect. When I first built this, I sort of just left it for a later day, and that day has come today. I've downloaded a mod, I can't remember which mod it is, but where I use the lane connectors to decide which of the tracks shows up. It doesn't work on all networks, I found, but it works here. And what I did was basically just only have the tram tracks showing on the corners where the angles were a little more favorable, and then I only had I only routed the trams on those tracks. And yeah, just sort of finishing up with a lot of intersection marking tool work on this area, kind of just basically making this like sort of finalizing this area. Obviously, it's sort of I've had these networks down for a long time, but I sort of needed to actually spend the time detailing them to make them look right. And I guess another thing I should mention is the way I set up the street grid in this area, as I'm now getting into actually placing down some buildings. I only had, I think, 2 of these kind of east-west streets crossing or like intersecting with the main boulevard, and the other ones are kind of just dead ends because I didn't want a ton of car traffic going through. I wanted to make it easier for pedestrians and cyclists. And yeah, you can kind of see that there where every other street doesn't intersect with the main road. I'm also using a similar technique that I've used before with using intersection marking tool and adding trees. This way, very easy to get like a consistent look. Obviously, this is an area where the city probably developed, all at the same time, so it makes sense the trees would be the same size and sort of evenly spaced. And another thing I should mention is I used a couple different styles. I sort of had this idea in my head when I first started the project. I was going to have different kind of regions represented, and I did that here by placing in these sort of Montreal-based buildings. And then as you'll see in the cinematic here in a second, I sort of had more like New England style row houses on kind of the northeast part of it, and then some more like German, Central European style buildings on the bottom part of the screen. And I'm really happy with how that area turned out. I think it looks really good, and the different styles kind of mesh together really well. Now I'm getting into kind of the actual main part of the episode, which is this kind of cliffside castle fort structure. I haven't really decided what the actual backstory of it's going to be. And yeah, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, you guys can put your ideas in the comments down below. I think this is a really cool build, and the kind of story behind it could be really interesting. And yeah, in terms of how I actually ended up building this, it started off with kind of some basic terraforming. I sort of just um, flattened out the area where I wanted this whole build to sit, and then also pushed the kind of seabed up close to the cliff. So I had this almost like near vertical face. And yeah, once the water kind of settled down from all the terraforming, and I moved away some of the trees, I could start sort of getting this cliff face together by using the gray flame rocks. This is not a unique technique necessarily. I mean, this is something that I'm sure you've seen other YouTubers do, and the reason for that is this is definitely the best way of getting these super like jagged, but also like natural and realistic looking cliffs. Converting these rocks to procedural objects, it works super well just because the rocks have super good textures on them. And then I also mixed in some of these surface rocks, which are like the terrain conforming ones, and I placed those kind of on the area directly where the water meets the land. And I think that worked really well as a sort of a transition between kind of a rocky beach almost, and then kind of this sheer cliff face, kind of just sort of stretching above and then kind of meeting the land. And this is really, it's something that's really difficult to do within the confines of the game to create cliffs like this, just because of the limits with the kind of terrain mesh and stuff like that. And yeah, using these rocks is an absolute game changer for natural looking builds like this. You'll see I also kind of had this kind of one main like headland almost that kind of was the near vertical face, and then I kind of transitioned into the kind of more mellower slopes. And yeah, as you can see, I'm using the surface rocks to kind of help with that transition. I was kind of thinking in terms of the actual how this would look naturally in terms of if this was like a real world place. The kind of most exposed part of the cliff face is probably the one that's been most worn away over the years, and that's why it's kind of the most exposed and jagged. And then kind of areas that are a little more protected are more just sort of rocky, and maybe then the ones that are kind of sheltered, or maybe where the beaches are, stuff like that. I didn't think through necessarily how like the different like ocean currents work in the area, but that was kind of my mindset for just giving myself a baseline for how to put this together. And as you can see, I also just kind of went back through and terraformed, sort of like the rocks kind of just blend right into the land. And yeah, I think it overall really works out really well. I'm really happy with how natural it looks. And you'll see when I start placing down the actual building that I use, how the kind of juxtaposition of this massive building with these rocks is really, really interesting. And also, as you can see here, as I fill out the kind of natural, like the trees and bushes and stuff, that really brings things to life. I add a couple of shrubs and these kind of areas between rocks, and I think these are like the river reed assets to kind of fill in some of these gaps. I think this works really well. I use these in the area on the mainland when I built that river, but they work super well for this purpose as well. And I also added just some ground cover props, which I wouldn't do like in a big forest because it would you wouldn't really see them, but in a kind of a more exposed area like this, where I'm kind of focusing on the nature, it's definitely worthwhile. Now moving on to actually placing down the asset. I don't remember the actual name of this building. I think it's a German castle. As I mentioned in the introduction, I don't know what exactly the backstory is for this structure within the city of Nyrstad. I basically just knew that on this headland I wanted to have some kind of iconic building here, iconic historical structure. And I saw this asset in the workshop. I was kind of looking around for like castles or museums or stuff like that. And I think this one really works in this area. I like kind of how it has an irregular shape. And yeah, my mindset was that, or sort of what I was thinking when I was placing this down, is maybe some like, rich guy like built a massive estate up here, and through the years it maybe fell into disrepair or something, and now it's just been taken over by the city as a park. You'll see a big part of the build that I do here is adding a bunch of gardens and stuff. And yeah, I can imagine this would be a really nice place to come just hang out. Obviously there's great views. of the mainland, of the mountains kind of off in the distance. And yeah, it's a super unique location, especially since it's right in the middle of the city. Um, and yeah, I mean, if you guys have any other ideas, obviously put them down below. I'd love to hear what the story is behind this structure here. As you can see, it's kind of set on the highest part of the island that Nyrstad is on. So I used the network multi-tool to like get this like nice curving sloped road with a couple of switchbacks, which I think is also a nice touch. It kind of helps set it apart from the kind of densely packed city below. I guess another thing I should talk about is the way the terrain is set up on the island here. Um, Obviously, there's this kind of headland, which is like the highest point, and there's also kind of that like central hill that's kind of separating the bridge that goes between this island and the island where the airport is. And I spent a lot of time kind of thinking through how the geology of this area kind of would work, and my sort of thought was that kind of central ridge almost is kind of just a continuation of the mountain range from the main island. And then this area, as I mentioned before, like the cliff is kind of, I'm not sure exactly how the different like rocks would work out necessarily, but this has kind of been worn away it's kind of more exposed to the ocean. So this has been more worn away over the years, and that's what generated this kind of massive cliff face. Yeah, I'm not really sure the realism of that necessarily, but that was kind of my mindset, what I was thinking about. In terms of what I'm building now, this is a really cool part of the build. I thought I built this kind of like nature path that goes from the beach, kind of winds through these trees along the cliff face, and then kind of connects directly into this park. I started off by using the elevated concrete pedestrian path to kind of just get an idea of where I wanted this trail to go, and then I converted it just to the vanilla gravel path, which ended up working super well because I used the node controller and shrunk all the nodes down to I think 70% of the original size, which kind of gave this really nice effect where the gravel path was no longer continuous and it kind of looked more natural, especially when it was winding through the trees and grass and stuff that I placed down. So yeah, that was a super helpful technique that hadn't used before. I hadn't really thought of. Yeah, once I started using that, this kind of natural scene really came to life. And yeah, obviously this is a real path still. Like citizens can walk on it. I haven't really gone through and set up like this as an actual park. I think I've labeled it on the map as a park, but I haven't put down any of the gates or anything like that. So once I do that, I'll have hopefully citizens walking along the water and then like through this really interesting looking path up to this kind of really unique castle. And yeah, I'm super happy with how that worked out. Another thing that I'm doing here is converting this part that's kind of hanging over the cliff face almost into the elevated path version. And again, this ended up working really well. It's always nice when I can use a vanilla asset like this. And yeah, again, sort of connecting some of those disconnected areas with the surface painter, and then kind of going back through, adding the bushes and the grass and some of these smaller rocks along the coastline to kind of blend everything together. Another thing I do here is just adding some of these breakwater rocks. This kind of transitions to what's going to end up being a more developed area along the coastline. I haven't thought through my plans for that beach area necessarily, but it's kind of built up around that elevated metro station. So obviously that's going to be a little bit higher density and going to have a lot more development along the waterfront. Now I'm moving on to actually detailing up this kind of garden area. As I mentioned before, I started off by placing down those kind of wooden fences to discourage people from like clambering down the rocks. And then I'm kind of outlining this building with the planters. I've used these planters a bunch of times before, and they're just a great asset for creating these gardens. And I like how you can kind of just overlap them easily. And then putting down a bunch of flower bushes, kind of mixing up the colors, stuff like that. Placing these garden areas are pretty fun to build. And as you can see, I'll end up using some decals and procedural objects and stuff to kind of customize this little area. And yeah, this decal right here is the manicured grass detail, which is definitely one of the better assets. I mean, it's been around a long time, but it just is absolutely perfect for this purpose, especially, like right here where I sink it into the ground a little bit to kind of make the color not quite as bright. It ends up working really well, and I'm really happy with how it kind of unifies this area and gives it kind of a consistent theme and kind of sets it apart from the heavily wooded kind of forested areas. that are all around it. Speaking of the kind of forests in the area, I am happy with how this build turned out, both because of the details here, but then also it allowed me to finish a really large part of the island without actually having to build a ton, which was nice because, as I've mentioned before, my goal with this series is to, at the very least, finish developing the entire island where Nyrstad is. I probably should come up with a name for the island that's separate from the city of Nyrstad. Um, that's another thing that if you guys have any ideas for, feel free to let me know. But yeah, obviously the deadline in a sense is the release of City Skylines 2. I want to have this whole project, or not necessarily the whole project finished, but just have like a natural stopping point where I can feel comfortable moving on to a new project. And yeah, I'm kind of glad that I'm getting close to that point with this project because it's gotten a lot more difficult to like load up the game and stuff like that. It's been a lot more of a burden in a sense, just because it takes so long to get into the save. Having said that, there's definitely a few more projects that I'm excited about completing in the next couple of weeks. I've talked about some of these before, but namely, I want to build a university kind of built into the hillside almost. I think there's a lot of interesting potential there. I also want to finish the area kind of by the initial place where I built the school, kind of west of the main lake. And obviously, like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to build the kind of beach community. Maybe that I'm sort of thinking in terms of the backstory that might have been its own separate city that's kind of merged into Nyrstad as there's been more modern development. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of get to a sense of like where I've finalized the build, and there obviously will still be kind of a story to discuss, and I'm kind of interested in having kind of an ongoing discussion. We've talked a little bit on my Discord about just kind of the different, obviously, the different soccer teams and the different transit lines and stuff. And I'm excited about kind of just having that kind of just to think about and to kind of like, it's just kind of a cool thing to kind of keep in the back of my head as I'm going into a new project in City Skylines 2, which obviously I don't know what that's going to look like. It's probably just going to be me figuring out the game along with all of you. But yeah, again, let me know. Obviously, there's a few more months of City Skylines 1. I still enjoy playing the game, so let me know if you guys have anything in particular you'd like to see. I'm obviously open to suggestions. And yeah, I've also considered, obviously, I mentioned that there's a few more projects in Vestanland that I'd like to do. There's also a few kind of, I've sort of been inspired by a couple of other sort of real world places, thinking about doing kind of like a mini series maybe if I get done with the sort of projects I want to do in Vestanland before City Skylines 2 is released. I might have some bandwidth to kind of like maybe do a couple episodes on a different project. So let me know if you'd be interested in that. Also, I'm just kind of looking for any kind of input. But yeah, having said all that, it's been so fun to build this project. Kind of have a set, like, not necessarily like schedule, but just like have like being able to release episodes and keep me interested in building the city. It's been really fun, and yeah, I'm looking forward to building a couple more projects here, and then moving on to other projects in the future. In terms of what I'm actually building on screen here, as I mentioned, I'm using procedural objects on these like stone tile decal things to create this network of paths through the garden. You'll see a little bit later on that I place down those elevated concrete networks and then turn them invisible to kind of make these paths actually functional. I also am using these sort of column-shaped trees to kind of outline everything, which I think looks really good. And then I'm sort of just filling up these flower beds with a sort of a wide variety of different flowers to kind of just sort of basing it. I want it to look really nice and fancy and like well maintained. Obviously, this is a tourist attraction, and there's probably a lot of money put into preserving this area. Again, we don't know exactly what the story is behind it, but I imagine there's a lot of people who are interested in making this look nice. Yeah, I think having the kind of very straight lines and like well maintained hedges and stuff, it really fits really well. And again, I'm really liking the contrast between the kind of well maintained, well manicured garden, and then kind of the more wild, like nature reserve type, um, like forest with paths and stuff like that. Makes this a really cool area, I think, for the city. And yeah, be a place that I'd be interested to go to. If this was a real place, it'd be really interesting, I think. Over the next few minutes, I'm definitely just going to sort of keep building out this garden area. Obviously, I didn't really talk about I didn't spend much time anyway talking about the road that leads up here. I used the same technique to kind of shrink it down and make the scale look a little bit more realistic, as I did with the gravel nature paths along the cliff face. And as you can see, I kind of have this like cul-de-sac drop-off area. I also added a gate for where people would enter this garden area. I had another gate kind of near the actual entrance of the building itself. And yeah, I sort of did that with the idea of making this. I didn't really. It's hard to say exactly because I didn't really use the actual game functionality in terms of the actual parks. I placed down like one of those invisible gates, but I didn't actually. As you'll see a little bit later on in the episode, I build another museum type building down closer to the city, and I was kind of thinking this all would be sort of one contiguous park in terms of how the city would actually manage it. I'm imagining that it's all kind of under the same governance structure, whatever that may be. And yeah, so I didn't really spend the time to actually make it like an actual like functioning park, just because I just didn't think that'd be worth it. Just it wouldn't make sense within the limitations of the game. I also used a lot of these fences here, the iron ones, but I used the brighter versions again, with the idea that this is a sort of well maintained area that's in really good shape. And these fences do a great job of kind of setting off the different regions, namely the gardens from more of just kind of like obviously like the parking and like drop off area, and then also the big kind of plaza with the kind of more viewing area. And yeah, lining the paths or lining the fences rather with the sort of smaller bushes is another really good effect. And I add another one of these gates here. Again, this is kind of the plaza thing with these benches, which again is a really kind of, it's obviously the views should be really incredible here. You can see the mountains off in the distance, and yeah, lining this area with these benches I think is a nice touch. I like how the kind of different angles came together here to kind of have this big like trapezoid shaped plaza thing. I thought that was really interesting looking. Then I also again use those sort of column trees to kind of blend in the manicured gardens with the forest right next to it. Now I'm going to spend some time working on this road here. Again, sort of fiddling around with the node controller to get the width of the road looking a little bit different in places. And then using the intersection marking tool to, again, kind of just add some detail, and then also add you'll see here in a second, I add like a bus lane. I haven't really focused on buses too much in the series thus far. I built a bus terminal a while back, which I was kind of thinking was more for intercity buses. And this obviously would be for like a local bus. I imagine I imagine that obviously tourism would be a big part of the economy in Nyrstad. Yeah, it's a beautiful city, and I imagine maybe this is like where like tourist buses would drop people off, something like that. And yeah, because I haven't really spent too much time actually focusing on any kind of local bus service, which I think I probably should. I think there should be. Obviously, we've done a lot with the trams and a lot of tram station down on the sort of the not really the valley, but just below this hill area. But yeah, obviously, I think it's good to have different types of transit service. And I've done sort of a disservice to the local buses, so I wanted to add in something for that here. Speak a little bit more about that, just to kind of give an overview of the different transit services in the city. We've got obviously the trams, which are really visible in a lot of areas, and then the metro, which I spent the recent episodes sort of developing. And that's another thing. I was talking about this, sort of rambling on about this earlier, but the metro is another thing that I would like to spend some more time kind of finalizing and getting all the lines kind of named, and like maybe making like a metro map of some kind. Yeah, I want to apologize for being a bit of a transit nerd in that sense. I mean, I think it'd be so cool to have like a actual like transit map with all the different tram and metro services. I'm not necessarily an expert with a graphic design or anything like that, so that's another thing that if you're interested in like working on something like that, the Discord would be a cool place to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, I always like thinking about that stuff when I'm putting down these stations and different lines and infrastructure. I think about how it's actually used and how it would show up on a map. Yeah, and again, maybe that's just me, but if you're interested in that stuff, feel free to stop by the Discord to talk about it. Um, and yeah, back to what's going on in the build. I'm doing similar technique as I did earlier with these paths. I have one kind of running along the water, and then one kind of winding just through the forest. I'm using the same technique with these surface rocks to kind of sort of transition between the cliff face and then what is going to be this kind of warehouse, like, sort of dockyard district. I'm not really sure exactly what that's going to be. I had kind of mentioned earlier, I think, that this is kind of obviously the harbor that I sort of started off with building, where there's that marina now. That was back in, I think, episode 4 of the series. Um, that area, I think, was probably the old cargo harbor, which now has been moved. Obviously, it's not built yet. This is another project that I would like to get to at some point. It's been moved to a big new facility close to where the airport is. But yeah, obviously that old harbor area has now been repurposed into like a park and marina. And I kind of wanted to put down this kind of area with some old docks and stuff. I'm not sure how realistic it would be to have docks like this kind of not within the kind of water break area. My sort of thought process was that this was an area kind of built more for warehouses and maybe like a cargo train station that's since been disused. The kind of backstory I had for the tram depot in the area was that was like an old sort of repurposing old cargo or freight train lines to kind of have a place for the trams to be stored. Yeah, let me know if that makes sense. I mean, I think that's a pretty reasonable explanation for that area, and obviously it wouldn't be. That's like the ships would have come in to where the marina is now, and then maybe those kind of dockland areas were, kind of just for storage or freight transport, stuff like that. But yeah, it's another area that I think could be really cool, really interesting. I know at least here in the United States, we have a lot of kind of really cool neighborhoods where they've repurposed a lot of old warehouse buildings like that into new kind of apartments or restaurant spaces, stuff like that. So yeah, that's another project that I would like to get to at some point. And yeah, in terms of the actually like finishing this castle fort, I'm not really sure what to call it. I'm building kind of what is basically like a sort of patio area on this kind of nice like nook that's created by the shape of the building and the cliff face. I'm imagining this building probably has like a restaurant associated with it of some kind, and this is obviously this would be, maybe it's like a really fancy like high end restaurant. It's hard to get tickets to, or maybe it's just like a sort of communal area. Maybe there's like a food court or something like that where people can kind of just bring food and enjoy the view. And yeah, now I'm moving on to kind of the secondary part of this build. I initially wanted to spend more time kind of fleshing this area out. But again, I was kind of like having a bit of a block because I didn't really know exactly what the backstory was, and I didn't know how to kind of mesh this with the rest of the city. This is more of a traditional museum. I was kind of thinking it's like maybe it's like a natural history museum. The ones with like the dinosaur fossils and stuff like that. And it's just in this really big, like grand looking building, which I really liked. I think both of these buildings that I use in this episode are German buildings. I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, anyway, the way I'm sort of creating this area, there's one of the most difficult parts or things to do in the game is to deal with these really subtle height differences, and I had to use a couple different retaining wall networks and stairs and surface networks like I'm doing on screen now to kind of create these kind of flat plaza areas. And the reason I used this surface network here is I wanted to place down kind of a stone or tile decal in this area. And obviously I couldn't do that with like the terrain, like it wasn't working, so I had to use the surface network, which ended up working pretty well. I also used the retaining walls to kind of set off the stairs here from the road, which is sloping a little bit more gradually. The kind of main entrance to the museum is going to be, kind of in the middle of the building, but then also kind of, more closer to the road, not necessarily where the tram tracks are. But then you'll see I placed down a tram station area. I think I actually don't show it on the actual process of placing it down, but you'll see it in the cinematics at the end. And then there'll be like kind of like a ramp, kind of swerving around the building. Kind of hard to explain. You'll see it at the end of the video. But yeah, I wanted this main entrance of the museum to kind of line up with the area that was on the road, where the road like met the terrain. So there was kind of a grand entrance. And then I also used a retaining wall to create this kind of plaza space to the edge here, where the building was kind of like almost like looks like it was kind of dug into this this hill, and has the road running on top of it. This area was it was kind of a pain to build, both because again dealing with the sort of terrain differences, especially when they're really slight like this, is always kind of difficult in city skylines. But then also my computer was kind of acting up, and it was running really slowly, so I had to. It kind of took longer than it should have. But yeah, I'm using these same column trees to kind of mark the areas that are maintained, and then kind of separate them from the more natural areas. I think that's a really nice effect. It worked out really well. And yeah, now I'm moving on to actually building out this plaza area. I think these are the same. These are the decals that come with the sort of those concrete pads that I use a lot before. Usually I turn them invisible, but in this case I'm using the same texture for this plaza area. I think it looks really nice how it's kind of a stark white color. It looks really, it looks like fancy and like well put together, which I think is fitting for a massive museum complex like this. I didn't really spend as much time as I would have liked on this area that's sort of marked off by the retaining wall. I think in real life there would be sort of a more obvious reason for why this area is flat and like dug out like this. I didn't really end up having the time or the inspiration to put anything there, which is kind of disappointing because it's kind of I feel like there was a potential for a cool kind of sub build there, but I didn't come up with anything. So if you have an idea for what could go in that area, just let me know. Using the same like prop line tool strategies to add in some bushes and stuff, not as much, not as detailed as the gardens up on the hill above, but kind of wanted something nice to kind of set this area apart from the kind of dense residential area that's kind of surrounding it a little bit. Now I'm creating this area where this kind of curved retaining wall creates this kind of slope up to the building from where the tram tracks are. And then I'm kind of finishing the building by taking just sort of copying and pasting it over, converting it to procedural objects, and then kind of shrinking it down a little bit to kind of create these kind of two wings off the back here. And I basically took out the middle part of this building by merging a bunch of these vertices together. This was a pretty tedious process, but in the end, it was nice to have this kind of the one consistent look, and having the same kind of, I guess these are like skylights in the middle here. And yeah, I'm really happy with how this building turns out. It's like sort of a hulking mass of a building, but yeah, I think it works really well for this purpose. Again, I haven't decided necessarily exactly what the actual museum is necessarily. So yeah, sort of tentative plan was like a natural history museum. But yeah, again, if you have any ideas for something specific that this could be, maybe it's like a national art gallery or something, I don't know. But yeah, I'm getting a little bit, I'm getting close to the end of the episode. And again, I would like to thank you all so much for watching. I'm sorry this episode got a little bit delayed. Again, I was having some trouble with the computer, trouble getting the game loaded up. But yeah, better late than never. And again, thank you guys so much for watching. You can check out the links below to look at my Instagram and Discord if you want to get more involved with the series and the channel. And yeah, I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. Bye.